This is Raphael.
I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which two siblings converse about anything and everything. Alrighty, so we've been talking a bit.
I've been talking a bit. Yes, we have.
Yeah, we've been in a call for hours now and just now started recording.
That's how it goes, unfortunately.
We did get one bonus episode out of it, but that was about it.
Yeah.
We're bad. But alas, we are getting to our planned topics of conversation. Now, this episode might be a little unique.
It will.
I feel like we're doing a lot of unique episodes these days, though.
I think that's the whole point of the second season is very unique episodes.
Yeah, I feel like the numbered episodes, I think our new criteria is for them to be a little unique.
Yeah.
I think even among that, this might be a little bit unique because this might be one of the more personal episodes I think we've ever done. And maybe among I don't know. We'll see if we make that a regular thing.
We'll see. I mean, we already did like personal creative heroes in the first episode.
This is true. This is true. We are getting a little personal.
Yeah, we're getting more into ourselves as people.
Yeah. Which is, I guess, an interesting thing to talk about because I guess we have a lot of thoughts on the world as is and art as is. But, I think it's also valuable, like we do with other artists, to understand the artists, but it's also valuable, I think, to be a little introspective and retrospective to kind of understand ourselves and help other people to understand us and where we're coming from and what our story is. And I feel like that's something I've been reflecting more on lately in recent years than ever before. And it's definitely something I want to get into more of a process of recording. And I think this podcast is perhaps a good way of doing that in some cases where we're able to do so publicly. Of course, not all of the areas are, but this was a subject that you proposed that I didn't really understand, I think, at first what you meant by it. But after some clarification, I realized, that's definitely something I can talk about as well. So, why don't you go ahead and introduce that? What do you mean by the title of this episode?
The title of the episode being Conditioned for Excellence, which is, I came into that title, as usual, in the middle of work, just kind of sitting down, doing menial stuff, just thinking about it and thinking about this topic and going like, well, what am I trying to get at? What is this? Like I realized, conditioned for excellence. But what does that mean? What does that mean to be conditioned for excellence, right? Why am I the way that I am? And I came to a realization. And I don't know if this is like a hot take. I don't know if this is like an oversharing, but I'm going with it anyways. Because I realized, yes, we're full committing. I realized something because of my new environment, which is another country. I am
being an American abroad.
I am now, and I am now an immigrant. It's something that I didn't think about before. It's like, oh my goodness, I have the experience that my mom had. But I realized, like, when I was in the US, you hear stuff about racism and microaggressions and all these other things, but that never really happened to me. I was like, oh yeah, I grew up in Southern California. There's a lot of Mexicans down there. You don't really think about nobody was racist to me. Nobody was like calling me out because of my race. I never lost any opportunities because I was brown skinned, right? Mm-hmm. That never happened. Or so I thought.
Right.
Because now that I'm an American abroad, I am seeing all these things as less of my race, a little bit, but less of my race. But now the same things are happening that I realized happened when I was younger because I am an American. You hear stuff about like, oh, Americans this, right? It's like, oh, now that I'm older and I can hear people talk about Americans in the way that maybe when I was in the US, people would talk about race or gender or sexuality or anything like that. I realized that was all happening the entire time and it was affecting me in ways that I wasn't really cognizant of. But now that I'm older, now I'm hearing it again, getting it all back
in a new context,
in a new context,
separated from the original.
Yeah, I'm coming to realize that had a really big impact for me, and that I was conditioned to be a workaholic, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So let's define our terms here of what exactly you meant by condition for excellence, because you're asking, what does that mean? It's like, well, let's explain to the audience what you mean by that. Like, what do you mean condition for excellence? And how do you explain that most humbly?
Most humbly, it turns out that I was in an environment growing up that forced me to be the best person that I was, or else, essentially, or the best person that I could be, right? And I was always pushed to be the best,
right? In terms of
just whatever success happened to be at the time, in like school or friends or anything like that, and that grew into being an adult, into being successful, or being it just grew to me wanting to be very good at everything that I touched.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of, we often talk about that, like there's like a kind of people that I think you and I both are, that we recognize when other people are that way too. That is kind of distinct. And again, trying to word this most humbly, but it's just like, basically, I think the simplest way to put it is that we're both very hard workers. And that is the most, I think, abstract way to put it. And there are definitely a lot of people in the world who are very hard workers, and you recognize them when you see them, right? They're real, I guess, go-getters, right? A personalities, however you want.
I was going to say like type A personalities.
Yeah. There are a lot of different ways of wording it, but that's essentially where we are. And it has always kind of been, to some extent, a distinguishing factor for us, right? It was part of, not necessarily always an identity factor, but it was something that we consider ourselves to be, right? We are hard workers, and we think of ourselves as hard workers, and we actively try to be hard workers.
And it's something that is noticeable upon meeting us, apparently.
Apparently, yeah.
One of the first things when I started like working in a like job environment, one of the first things I realized was that nobody else was putting in the amount of effort that I thought was minimum. Right. And what I consider to be the minimum amount of effort is actually above and beyond.
Yeah, I had to make the same adjustment myself, namely because like I was used to basically, I've essentially been working since I was 13. I just never thought of it that way, right?
Exactly.
Because I started creating, that was about when I started creating online like video content and stuff. And you know, I didn't really think of it as like an enterprise at that time. However, I now realize like I was doing things that people get paid to do. I was teaching myself to do them, and I was doing it like off school hours. Like I would go to school
on your own time.
I would come home and completely do all my homework and completely on my own time, just put in hours upon hours doing this thing that for all intents and purposes, like was work. Right. And that continued even long after, you know, schooling and whatnot. But the point is, like, I always had to be self-driven in that. And entering like more normative workplace environments, right, just as a worker, only a worker, and realizing that, again, because I've had to be mostly self-driven, whether in, you know, obviously school is one thing, and there's definitely some parallels to that, but to the way I was in school. But I think we were very different kinds of people in school. Yeah, like I quickly had to adjust to the fact that the amount of effort that I considered normative or minimum was different than what was expected of me, and was different than what everybody around me was doing. Maybe not everybody, but you know, definitely the majority.
It was not the norm. It was not the norm. It was like there's a difference between the expectations of us and what we expected of us.
Right. Yeah. We kind of held ourselves to different standards than what was necessarily appropriate for entry level jobs. A good way to say, right?
What was appropriate? What was another way to say, like, what was healthy?
Right. Yeah. And even then, I think it's still healthy just because we're used to it, right? Like, it's not like we're breaking ourselves in order to maintain that, just because.
Only because we've done it for so long.
Yes, that's fair.
In the same way that, like, you know, lifting 1,000 pounds might not be healthy for the average person, but.
Right. But if you're, you know, a bodybuilder or a strongman or whatever.
You're a strongman, and that was just last Tuesday. Very different levels of
context,
of effort. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess let's dive into that then, because you were kind of doing some introspection of, well, I think it was your experience now being an immigrant in a country that is not your homeland, kind of triggered the chain of thought, but it got you thinking about like what made you the way you are, what made us the way we are. And that was, I think, something that I'd never really given a lot of thought to before. I feel like it didn't really occur to me that there might be a reason, right? Like a discernible narrative behind that, right? Like, but once you started talking about it, I was like, wait, no, I kind of get what experience you're talking about.
For sure. And like, by no means is this the only reason we're this way, because
right. It's a confluence of factors, to be sure.
Of course. But this was just something that I just happened to come across, again, because what should have been new stimulus, I realized, was actually very familiar. And that kind of led me to think about why and where that came from. And I realized that, like, oh yeah, this is something that I've experienced before, but in a very different way, in a very different context. So as an American abroad, obviously it's worth noting in the that this is going to be a very timely probably episode, but like in the American like political climate as it is right now, and in the culture that's coming out of America, like what people think of as American culture, American politics, all of that coming together. Like, what do foreign people think of when they think of America? Most often, it's not going to be good things.
Right.
So as an American living abroad, I hear a lot of just people talking about like, oh man, Americans this, Americans that. Like, America is so screwed. Like, Americans are weird. Like, Americans are dangerous. They all have guns, right? And I'm like, well, I'm an American. And when you talk to me, and especially when you talk to me about America, that's different from how you talk to each other about America and how you view America. And that's very strange to me, I realized, because like I can hear you talking about how Americans are scary and how Americans are all psychopaths. And then you come and talk to me, an American, fully well knowing an American, as you would any normal person. So it's like there's a difference going on there. Like what is that?
Right. Yeah, there's a code switch that's happening there.
Yeah, there's a code switch. And I was like, oh, that's like, I don't know, like under any normal circumstance, that probably wouldn't have like occurred to me that was like that there was a reason behind that, right? But again,
right.
it felt familiar because that is something that I experienced as a youth, well, I like to think of myself as like the perfect amalgam of like subcultures and like things that like just make me the perfect minority. I am a minority in very nearly every sense of it. And hearing as a child, hearing people talk about sexuality and gender and race differently than when they're talking to me about those same stuff, I realized really affected me. Because when somebody is talking about how I'm just going to like throw some stuff out there, not saying that this is what I believe or what people believe or is true, right? Like, let's just say Mexicans are lazy, or Asians have like some kind of a work ethic or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And you hear that, and then you go, oh, well, if Mexicans are lazy, or like if Mexicans are like they're only good for like general labor jobs or anything like that, right? Like that's kind of like a very stereotypical thing. I don't want to be that. I don't want to do that. Like that's obviously a bad thing that you're talking about. I have to be better than that. I have to be a model minority. I have to be one of the good ones. And when I realized that was a phrase, one of the good ones, that was a phrase that I have used unironically, I realized there was a problem.
Yeah. This is kind of gets into an interesting, again, confluence of cultural factors. And I think some of which have been on my mind. But again, I never thought to link them. But yeah, there's definitely this sense, right, culturally, in which, because you and I grew up in, well, I guess it's no secret that you and I grew up in San Diego, California, right? Which, beautifully diverse place. Possibly one of the most diverse places, I don't know, in the world, I would dare argue. Like, I've really never...
You know what? Maybe. Who knows? California is super diverse.
Yeah.
Even compared to all of California, San Diego is diverse.
Yeah, right? Like, maybe LA to some extent, but even then, you got like...
Yeah, LA is just San Diego 2.0.
Yeah, essentially, right? It's just leveled up. But, I mean...
Big brother.
But really, like, I've been, like, in all sorts of different places across the country now.
Yeah.
And by no means everywhere, but I've been in a lot of places now since then, since moving out of California. And I'm like,
a good smattering of places.
Yeah. And with this smorgasbord of experience, like I've realized a lot more in my adulthood, just how gifted we were growing up with that kind of culture, or how spoiled in a sense, right? That it's just like, I have not been anywhere that is nearly that diverse, right?
Yeah.
I think I've seen more white people in the past 10 years in living in Pennsylvania than like I ever saw growing up, like the first 16 years of my life in California, right?
Well, that's the thing, like in Southern California, like white people are the majority, white people are the minority almost,
right?
Like it's certainly, well, because like especially in my high school, because my high school was like a shared living schooling facility for foster children, and so the demographics heavily skewed away from white people,
right?
And absolutely, like white delinquent children, I guess, like that's a minority where I come from. Like it was a very strange thing to think about.
Right. Yeah. Well, even when I think of my high school experience, I went to a pretty small like magnet school in a like decent part of San Diego, but it was also like that was like people had like token white friends, right? Essentially was the outlook, right? That was essentially how they were treated. And like that's an exceptional thing, I realize, as I've gotten older, right? Like it's a clear majority everywhere else, or in many other places, I should say.
Yeah.
Right. And I've kind of gotten a better glimpse of that as I've gotten older, and as I've had a bigger diversity of experiences. I've realized, okay, not everywhere is San Diego. But my point I'm trying to get at is, having grown up in that environment, it was very easy for us to think, like you were speaking on earlier, that we never encountered racism, right? Or we never, like, we hear about all these things, and sure, maybe we believe that it has an effect on our modern society intellectually, but it never happened to us. And it was very easy to conceive of that when you're growing up in that environment, right? A wonderfully diverse environment. But the thing is that the more I've reflected and analyzed on it, especially through the context of just who I am today, and thinking back, it's like, okay, where do a lot of our personality aspects come from, right? Or where do a lot of our most life-shaping events come from? A lot of it is uniquely like race-coded experiences. And it's, again, not in the sense of any explicit racism. Like, I don't think you and I have ever encountered anyone in, really using racial slurs against us in a way that was intended to harm us, right?
Because that was like, that's what you would think racism looks like.
Yeah,
right?
that's what we think it looks like, right?
Yeah. But now I'm understanding what a microaggression is, and realize, like, oh, these things are like, they are invisible, and they are things that you don't notice them, but you feel the effects of them over time.
Right. And culturally too, right? Like it permeates the culture. And that's the thing, is humans in general, like, have blind spots, tons, but you especially have blind spots to your native culture, right? We all have cultural blinders where our culture is so familiar to us that there are things we cannot see about it. And
because that's just the way it is.
Yeah. And I think it took you getting out of America and seeing it in a different context for it to finally awaken those patterns and really just start to try and put a name to it. Yeah. But I think that's probably how that kind of awakened in your journey, was getting out of your cultural context so that you could see it without the blinders. But also, like,
and it's a lot like louder, especially when it comes to like
being a foreigner.
Because as a foreigner, as somebody who is, I'm abroad for you, which is
right. Yeah, that's true. For you, it's just not where you live.
For me, this is just where I live now. Hearing what is for here abroad is very different, because it's like, there abroad is my home.
Right.
And so now I'm hearing how that experience looks like from the outside, right? So now I'm getting like, okay, this is what people think about the place where I came from, and that is completely different from what I think about having lived within that culture. And that also is just like a completely separate thing on its own, just like how other people view your
native culture.
Any culture. It could be geographic, or it could be like even like a fandom, right?
Right.
But the way other people talk about that is, it feels different hearing somebody talk about that from your experience having lived it.
Yeah, that must be a really out of body experience in this geographic sense.
And because of that, like, it's so loud, the difference. Much more subtle when it's all kind of the same,
when it's all at home.
And it's all at home. Yeah.
And that's why I kind of want to get at is, when you're growing up here in America, like, because we have these cultural blinders, right? We kind of look back in the history books, right? And we see, people getting shouted down, just trying to go to school for the first time. And you're like, okay, never experienced that. And again, it's easy to play that down as in, like, I've never felt the effects of racism, but it just changes form, right? And we're born into a world where it's like, thankfully, there has been progress made, and that kind of stuff, is generally a thing of the past. But you can't reverse, hundreds of years of just culture forming. And culture forms psychology in a lot of way, right? It forms mindsets in ways that are subtle, and it also forms patterns of accessibility too, of just like, what is your starting point? What is your family starting point, right? Compared to other places. And it's very fascinating when you start to think about it, because, well, first off, I was listening to a podcast today, actually, of, I'm a regular listener of the Holy Post. Big fan of that podcast. They have been doing a mini series called Why Are You Still a Christian?, where they're interviewing a number of people in the Christian subculture who have been pretty high profile and have been basically really torn apart by the Christian subculture for certain ideological stances they've had to take, right?
Yeah. That's a question I would love to ask you as well.
Oh yeah, maybe you could turn that question on me and do that interview at some point. But
at some point I would like to talk about like a little bit more about our personal beliefs. Obviously not going too much into it because that's a whole thing. But the philosophy of our belief, at least.
For sure. But they were doing one with a black kind of historian slash I don't know if he would really consider himself a Bible scholar, but biblical thinker for sure, named Jamar Tisby. He wrote a book called The Color of Compromise that I've actually read.
I was gonna say that name sounds familiar, and then like I remember we talked about him before.
Yeah. So and he was pointing out like these details that I think are quite relevant here, which is the fact that like even if you grow up in a community of color. Mm-hmm. There's still this sense in our culture that permeates the air, right? That's in the air you breathe, that you have to kind of deprogram yourself actively from, because you don't even realize it. Like stuff like how he pointed out how and I've heard a number of people essentially frame this in different ways, but this idea that like basically the majority culture, which, in America is generally, kind of middle class whites, say middle to upper class whites. And that is the correct culture, right? And that is the correct framework and
that is something to aspire to.
Yeah, it's something to aspire to. It's something that is proper. That's a word I've heard used a lot too, especially when it comes to if I've heard people use that when they come to recognize like certain dialects, like American dialects that are not right, like essentially like white middle to upper class dialects, right? It's just like that's not proper speak. Or it's just like, or if they catch someone code switching, who's a minority, and it's just like, oh, so it's like, they can go back and forth between speaking properly and, speaking improperly, which is, again, the idea.
By extent.
Yeah, exactly, right? Speaking improperly, but it's like, it's not an improper language. It's just not your culture's language. But there's this implicit agreement, right? That the majority culture's language or the majority culture in general is the right culture, right? And and like you said, things like saying like, I want to be one of the good ones, quote unquote, right? Phrasing like that, right? Is just little things that we catch ourselves playing into, even growing up in very colorful communities, that is just, again, it's just part of the culture. It's part of the air we breathe, and we are blind to it unless you actively start like analyzing it or, trying to push against it. But it's just little stuff like that seem harmless, but
it always seems harmless.
Yeah.
It always seems harmless. That's kind of the point of a microaggression, right? It's something that under different circumstances could have been seen as maybe playful or joking, right? But over time, it builds up, it adds up, and it's like, okay, it's not a joke anymore. This is really starting to like affect me, but you don't notice when that happens.
Yeah. And that's a fascinating thing as well. And of course, we could get into all sorts of stories about, I think, generational and systemic issues with racism, which definitely influenced, I think, a lot of us as well in ways that we have, never really fully quite reckoned with. And that's definitely a huge thing. And perhaps that's a larger conversation for another time. But right, those realities exist as well. And it's very fascinating to see, because for me, especially, I think because of the circles in which I walk, right? I've had opportunity to perhaps be in a lot more like white and conservative spaces than you have. And there's a lot of things about my experience and my life story that I think because of that have kind of come to view as being like unique, right? Like I was like, oh, I just have a very unique story. But then I think in more recent years, kind of hearing more stories from more people of color or more people in marginalized positions in the country, even outside of people of color, even marginalized whites, right? Or poor whites. I come to find it's just like, oh, my story isn't unique. It's actually, I mean, they're obviously not in the same exact form, but it's just like the elements of my story that I thought were unique can also be found in a lot of other people. And again, while it's not exactly the same in their details, it's still enough to recognize a pattern and being like, this is a pattern, right? The things that have been like the biggest deciding factors and traumas and obstacles in my life are things that lots of other people have experienced just by also being at the margins. Like this isn't a unique experience. It's just, I just thought it was unique because was spending a lot of time in environments where nobody else had these experiences.
Exactly. And to be clear as well, because between you and me, the racial aspect is the side that we share, obviously. But on my side, it's a whole lot of other stuff going on. Like, again, with gender and sexuality and with like beliefs as well. Like, there's a whole lot of stuff that as a youth, it was less obvious because I didn't realize these things about me. I wasn't thinking in those terms. But as I grew up, I'm hearing all this stuff and how everybody talks about these categories and realizing that they don't realize they're talking about me, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like and that's the thing is,
especially because all those things like race it's pretty obvious. I'm very obviously brown skinned. But when it comes to my gender or sexuality, that's not clear. That's not obvious. You have to really probe or ask a direct question, which that is improper. Apparently, I don't know. Just ask. It's fine. Nobody cares. Like you would never know, right? You would absolutely never know any of that stuff unless it was just like,
well, it's literally invisible, right? It's literally generally invisible, yeah. Well, excepting certain circumstances, it's like generally invisible though, right? There are not visible tells. It's
a lot easier to hide, especially. Yeah. It's a lot easier to hide if that is like you cannot be a closeted Mexican, let's say that.
Right. Well, there was such a thing as white passing, but
I guess that's true. Now that I'm thinking about it, actually, there's a lot of people who are Mexican, born in Mexico, with white parents. I remember there's a story that my teacher used to tell. She's my English teacher. Love her. She was one of the first people who got me really into like activism, like proper, actual grassroots activism. And she was hardcore. She was awesome. And she would tell the story of her friend who was like Mexican culturally, right? 100% born and raised in Mexico, but his parents were white. And so he would come to like the US or the States or whatever, and he would hear people talking Spanish, or he would be around people who were obviously Mexican culturally and ethnically as well, and not realizing that he was also culturally Mexican. And then all the stories that he would tell of, catching people out, right? And saying like, oh, like this white boy, he doesn't know what he's doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so that goes a lot of different ways. There are lots of different nuances on it.
Yeah, so like, yeah, there are no absolutes. It's one of the things I believe in. There are no absolutes. Everything's a spectrum, and there's always a gradient. But there are systems, and there are patterns, and there are shared experiences, shared human experiences. They're not only within this one thing, like not only within the racial aspect of it. You can find them everywhere. You can find people with having that same kind of experience through all sorts of different cultures and for as many different reasons as well.
Yeah.
Some more or less obvious, but this is just the reason, like this is the stuff that I realized was the most.
Yeah. These were the reasons in our story.
In our story, and was one that we shared because obviously we have the same ethnicity.
Right. Yeah.
Weird if
that's true. There are other elements for sure that we don't share.
Yeah.
And that's why I was also careful to mention, right, of they're just like impoverished whites earlier too, right? Like I have found an incredible amount of kinship across that cultural line, even though it's like vastly different culture than I'm used to. It's also just like there's a lot of shared experiences there, right? There's a lot of things that it's just like, oh, you could actually understand that, even if like, politics say we should be like mortal enemies, right? Like it's like there's obviously a shared experience there, just because those are also people at the margins. And it just turns out like wherever you have people at the margins, you're going to get shared experiences when a majority culture is obvious and more powerful than any of these other cultures.
Yeah, like one of my as you brought up the kinship with impoverished whites. Let's use that term. It reminds me in high school I had this, I don't know, let's call it a phase, where I was very enamored with juggalos and the juggalo lifestyle, and I was like, this is like really interesting because I didn't realize like these white people over here like they could be so cool. But yeah, it's the exact same thing, right? Like the whole thing about the juggalo lifestyle, the reason people buy into it is the idea of like it's a family. Like that's what they call themselves. They call each other like the juggalo fandom is called the family. Like you are all family, and you all have the thing that you all share is this feeling of like being underneath everybody, right? Because these are the kids who are in the trailer parks. These are the kids who grew up in the dirtiest parts of the town that you don't go by, and like they aren't of color, and they have the exact same experiences, but it's slightly different because of the fact that they aren't of color. Even though they're not, black, or they're not brown, or they're not anything else. Like if they are seen, right, driving down the street in a nice looking car that they bought off of hard earned money, and they are well known to be from the ghetto, right? Like they're from the trailer park, they're gonna get stopped.
Yeah,
because that's not supposed to happen. And it's like, whoa, that's weird. I didn't know that was possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like some trailer trash white kid driving down in a nice car. That's a bad thing.
That's a felony.
Yeah, it's like not because they're white. Obviously, it's like
yeah, exactly. In that case, race isn't the factor.
But it's the stories that we all share between that, because it's the shared experiences.
Exactly, right?
And of course, we're not blaming any one race either.
Exactly, right? That's the point. It really seems like it has to do more with being at a society's margins,
exactly. Right? And that's what it comes down to.
And having some factor that puts you there that you didn't have control over. And
just the luck of the draw.
Yeah. And that experience can be found in a variety of ways. Like we said, there's a variety of reasons it happens that way.
Yeah.
Race isn't the only factor, to be sure. It's a big one. It's one that overwhelmingly, like the statistics bear out, that it is a much more major factor than it should be. It seems like economics is probably the major driving factor.
It is.
But when you look at the statistics,
that's also tied into race as well.
Exactly, right? Statistically, those factors are more interlinked than they should be in this country, right? Or in my country, I should say at this point. That's
that's weird. Yeah. And that just comes down to the culture, how history panned out. Like
exactly.
If history happened in a different way, who knows what could have happened, right?
Right, yeah. Like colonization efforts could have happened entirely differently. Who knows? Right? Yeah. All right. Maybe it didn't have to be that way.
it all eventually does come down to, I would say, it all eventually just comes down to money, especially in the current culture that we've built for ourselves, because all of these things like race or gender or sexuality all have a monetary value when you really kind of start to think about it. If you are in a culture that is based around the dollar bill, right? Because the embracing, the rejection, or the ignoring of any of those traits can be good or bad monetarily. And depending on where you're at is going to be what happens. And people are heavily motivated by money because you need to eat. And you need to live, and you need a place to stay. You need a roof over your head. And because of that, whatever region you happen to be in, there will be a trait that you would think should be completely separate from economics that is now linked because it is profitable to think one way or another about that thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then you get into big groupthink sorts. But yeah, so that gets into a larger conversation about, race and class and identity politics. But I feel like in order to not drift too far from our core subject here as it relates to us, it's just kind of understanding that that's in our background, even if we don't recognize it as such, right? It could be easy to look back in our childhood and realize it's like, okay, we had a lot of privileges that prior generations of our family didn't. This is true. And it was certainly a lot less of a factor for us as it was probably for our parents, right? And those are all things to keep in mind. But that doesn't mean that it didn't have a hand in our formation, because it clearly had an effect on us. And things that we didn't realize were a result of that effect, right? We're now kind of in hindsight realizing we're kind of the genesis of a lot of, I guess, quirks of ours, if you will. That were really just kind of life-defining habits that in some ways are kind of good. It's not a necessarily bad thing to have a lot of drive, if you will, but in a lot of ways can be very unhealthy. Like you said, essentially, like we could be workaholics sometimes. And sometimes that it can be difficult to find a balance for that. And that's something I think we're all still figuring out. But I think we've both definitely come to a lot better place now than we once were, in understanding that there is a lot of things to value in life besides what you produce. And honestly, I've kind of felt like I've generally been in a happy place in these past couple of years with regard to work ethic. Even if it does, even if I do have to strain myself a little bit every once in a while, but it's like those factors are all, it's a confluence of many different factors, but all that result in this personality that's full of drive, and it's the same kind of drive that you hear about, even if it looks entirely differently because we had a little bit more of an education in our foundation. But it's the same kind of drive that you have in any people you see in marginalized communities who have a passion for escaping.
Exactly. It's getting out of it. It's stopping the cycle is something you hear a lot about, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I think I'm at the point now where I'm still trying to figure out my balance between like my obligation to be busy and my want to just rest. Really, that's all it is. All it comes down to. Just like, it's like, there's this like weird battle in me where I'm constantly just like, I have to be busy. I have to be productive. I have to do something today. But man, I really just want to lay down and rest and take a day off and but I can't take a day off because I'm so busy. But I'm so busy that I'm too tired to do anything. So I got to rest. It's like, there's this constant battle, right? And like, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah. It causes anxiety sometimes, right? It's just like,
absolutely.
Like not doing something is something that still kind of causes anxiety in me sometimes, right? Like taking a day off is just a horrifying thought, it stresses me out.
It feels taboo.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I realized I had a problem still when I'm like 3 different projects deep right now, trying to get different stuff. And I've got like a professional commission that I've got to finish. And then a friend comes up. I think, I don't have to get into the details, but you I think you might be aware of which project I'm talking about. A friend comes up and says, hey, we saw this opportunity in this community to be able to do something. Like there's an opportunity available to us if we take it. And I was like, absolutely, sign me up. I can manage that. You guys take care of all the work. Sign me up. I'll take care of it. We'll get this project going. And I'm like, oh no, I just added another thing to my list of things that I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I hard committed. I was like, yes, exactly. This is perfect. You have a clear vision. You know exactly what you want to get into. You have a plan, right? Not just like a dream. Like you guys actually have a plan. I'm like, you know what? I see promise. This is perfect. All you need is a manager. All you need is somebody to like give some oversight and organize everything.
Yeah,
I can do that.
Just manage. That's what you always is to say,
Exactly. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And then I'm like, oh no, I did it again. Loryn, what'd you do?
I'm kind of in the same boat. It's even worse for me now that I'm working on like one of the most massive projects I've ever worked on, my own wedding. But that's like a whole thing in and of itself. But I'm constantly fighting against the urge to start a new thing, right? Like there's so many different projects. But it sucks because I feel like I'm on a timetable now where it's just like, okay, I'm not going to be in this region for much longer. Mm-hmm. And now I feel like I have to squeeze in a lot of different regional projects that I want to do into a short span of time
before you leave.
Yeah. So that impulse is bugging me. But right, that's just something that exists in us. But I think the reason that exists in the form that it does, though, is because relaxing and time off in this capitalist society is a commodity that like not everybody gets to cherish, right?
Yeah.
I think also of another interview I've heard recently with Esau McCulley, biblical scholar, Black Bible scholar, but he was talking about his experience going to college, and he was doing a similar sort of reflection as what we're doing now of his own past and his own traumas, and specifically his own relationship with his father in apparently a brilliant new memoir that he made that delves into that stuff that I really want to read now. But he was talking about his experience going to college. And it was definitely not in a majority Black environment. It was in a majority white one. And when he got into that environment and he recognized, like, first off, this is a thing you'll commonly hear, I guess, in a lot of marginalized groups is first person in my family to go to college, right? Exactly. You've probably heard that phrase more than once. At least I know I have.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Within our own family.
For us, it actually, even within our own family, we weren't it, but pretty sure we know who the first person in our family to go to college was. But it's within that amount of grasp is kind of the idea, right? That kind of helps me to realize.
Actually, on one end of our family, we are the first people to be in our family to go to college on one end.
That is true.
I know that for a fact.
That's true. On one side of our family, we are the first people to go to college.
Yeah.
That is very true. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, he was talking about that. And Esau McCulley, lo and behold, first person in his family to go to college. He gets there and he had to work his butt off to get there. And,
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And when he got there, he was very surprised to find that there are people there who didn't, right? There were like C average students.
Which must have been like a kick in the butt.
Yeah, there were like C average students who are just got right into this college, right? Like he was a sweet summer child, like completely wasn't aware of the existence of like legacy admissions and things like that. So that was a bit of a culture shock for him, and he had to kind of reckon with that. But I love what he pointed out though, which is that, you know, he's not railing on that, like because equality shouldn't be about making it as hard for everyone to get into college as it was for him, right?
Exactly.
Equality should be about making it so that it's easy as for everyone as it was for them, right, to get into college. Because the things that put them in that position, where like it's not that they weren't hard workers or deep thinkers, it was just that, right, they were kids at one point, right? Like they weren't the best students all the time. They were, you know, they messed around as young people do. And
they just had a lot more allowances.
Yeah, they just had a bigger margin of error, right? Because for a lot of people, making mistakes as a kid can ruin your whole life, right? You don't get second chances.
Absolutely.
And that's ultimately what equality is about, is making it so that everybody has the chance to make mistakes and be a kid. And that's ultimately not the case for everyone. Like I said, time off and, you know, taking a break and relaxing is currently a commodity that is not available to everybody. And being able to, right, basically end your, you know, stop your hustle for like 5 minutes, or, you know, be able to not have to constantly exert yourself in order to make it by, right? These are realities that
constant push.
Yeah, like that is, being able to forego that is to some extent still a luxury for a lot of people. Yeah. And
it's a privilege.
Yeah, it's a privilege. I guess I'm a little hesitant to use that word sometimes, but yeah, that this is like the appropriate use case for it, right? Yeah. It is a privilege, right? And yeah, again, equality isn't about taking that privilege away from anybody. It's about making that privilege available to more people. And that's not an impossible task, but we also have to reckon with the fact that, again, we come from a place where scarcity is still a part of the mindset, and it affects the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. And I guess for me, just in recent years, just kind of reckoning with where that came from with you has been an interesting journey. And I'm learning more about it every day. And again, learning which parts of my story are not unique and which parts are unique, and learning to parse between them is definitely been a valuable exercise in thought.
Yeah, because really the stories that we hear and the stories that we share between like all these very, very different, but also, you know, very similar marginalized groups, it is really just a human story of just trying to make your way, right, in the world that you're given, in the world that you're born in the
wilderness, to use the kind of a literary or even biblical sense of putting it, right? The wilderness. That's where we are, and everybody's trying to make their way in the wilderness.
The only difference is that some people were born with more tools. They were given more tools at the start to be able to make their way through, and some people had to forge their way, fashion their own tools. Yeah, and we've been fashioning our own tools for so long, we didn't realize you could just buy them off the shelf.
Yeah, this is very true. But you still have to build yourself to the point where you can do that. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of been on, I guess, a journey and a transition for us. But yeah. Like I said, it's been an interesting thought journey to take with you, though, too, to kind of parse all this stuff. And it's something that I think is still an ongoing project for us both as the years go on. So yeah, I think that's a fruitful place to end the conversation.
I think so too. I mean, we actually made our 1 hour mark.
We did. With some change. I almost feel like we have to keep talking for 10 minutes now.
See, this is the problem, Raph.
Yeah. Save it. So yeah, thank you all very much for listening. Hopefully we didn't offend anyone. I don't think there was anything too controversial here.
And if we did, we really try very hard on this podcast to be inoffensive. However, I would like it to be known that is not my normal personality.
This is true. Loryn is notoriously offensive in some ways.
In some ways, it is on purpose, because it's a very good filter, for being completely honest.
Yeah.
But like, man, like if we can, just for one episode, just talk fully, like completely frank, that would be amazing.
That would be.
Obviously not.
Again, we try.
I don't even know if we're going to keep any of this in.
Yeah. Obviously, I almost hate to say this, but like it is very true that there are different ways that you talk to people that you're very familiar with versus the general public, because, you know, different people have different tolerances, and you know what the tolerances are of the people that you're close to. So obviously, there is a certain amount of self-control we have to do when being on the air. And, but that being said, it's certainly never an intention for me, at least, to offend. And it's certainly never.
While I'm live, yes. Yeah. I do not intend to. I very much intend to be as appealing to all audiences as I can be.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of our purposes here. Again, we have a certain, we've taken a little bit more of an educational tenor as the Hypercube has evolved. And I feel like the thing about that, and the thing with Hypercube in general, and part of our mission in general, right, is making enabling artists, and I think enabling learners is also going into that, right? Learners in general, because what is an artist but just a learner of art? And it's, the thing is, we want that openness, right? We want that availability for everybody, and we don't want to by any means like lock anybody out of that. And so
absolutely not.
That being said, I think this is probably the most vulnerable and frank I think we have been able to be on a podcast. And that definitely comes with its own challenges and its own nerves. But it's also, I do think that while we try our best not to offend anyone, it should never come at the expense of honesty when we're having frank conversations like this. But that being said, I think I think we managed to cover our bases pretty well in giving a fair kind of view of the playing field. And it's definitely been very true to our experience that really there are less differences between everybody than there seems. And
that just is a general statement. Like, you have more in common with the people you hate than you think.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, there's still only one human experience, and that is the experience of the human condition and how we all try to navigate that in a complex and broken world. So perhaps that's a bit of a deeper note to end it on, but again, thank you all very much for listening. This has been the Hypercube podcast. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with original theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see you all later. God bless.
Adios.